Welcome to the Halloween edition of the COVID update. I will be going through some things that I usually go through, a couple new things. So looking at the global regions and how the pandemic is progressing there in the global model for cases and deaths for countries, and then the sum of the countries model view of the world. One thing I'll dive a little more deeply into this month is excess deaths. I've talked about that last month for India, and now I'm looking at it broadly across the world. It's pretty interesting, I think. And then the US models for cases and deaths, individual states, just showing again the latest view of the distribution of the case fatality rates across countries and across states, which hasn't really changed very much from last month. Unfortunately, yesterday, my California county models became corrupted somehow, so they couldn't be open to run. So there's no California, some of the counties models, but I will go through the state model. And then a brief local update on Santa Barbara, and then some of the topics I usually cover on anything that may be new on variants, and then how the vaccination progress is going. So in summary, this is pretty similar to last month. So 2 months ago, we were up at 650 to 700,000 cases a day as Earth overall. And we've dropped to about 450 last month. And in the intervening month, we've pretty much plateaued between 400 and 450,000 cases a day. So, and that's because many resurgences have declined significantly. But regions in Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, I'll show you some of those, are beginning to really surge again. The month or two ago, hotspots of South Asia, like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Southeast Asia, like Taiwan, Indonesia, and Vietnam, have declined significantly. That whole group of outbreaks was very sharp, very rapid rise to unprecedented levels. It's been a rapid decline. We continue to see variants emerge, but so far none of them are looking like they will displace the Delta variant. Now, update that. As I mentioned, a review of excess deaths globally is included, and the conclusion from that is that the deaths attributable to COVID-19 may be about twice as high overall as the official totals. Vaccinations continue to grow globally, with about 25 million doses administered daily. Vaccinations are declining in terms of the daily doses in many Western countries as they get pretty vaccinated. Some of the more highly vaccinated countries still see high per capita new cases, and as I've talked about the last couple months. And I'll update the high fatality rate per capita group with their vaccination progress. And then, as always, I'll complain about the data for the countries that have anomalies that make it challenging to model. So all these data are taken from the Johns Hopkins database, and these are data from Friday. So looking at the overall progression of the global outbreaks, there have been no changes to the 50 largest outbreaks, so no new countries. Last month we had a couple countries drop out and a couple countries come in. That stayed the same. There continues, as there has been for a long time, to be no growth in small outbreaks. Most of the growth, similar to last month, is in the number of outbreaks over 200,000 to 1 million, in that range. There's been some growth in some of the larger than that outbreaks, so 20% growth in outbreaks over 2 million and 25% growth in outbreaks over 5 million. Those are these two bars here. And same as last month, we just have these two outbreaks over 10 and 20 million. And there actually are no outbreaks between 10 and 20 million now. So there's India and the US up way over 20. Everybody else is less than 10. Although that may be different next month. When we look at the regional breakdown, as I mentioned before, the cases have been fairly flat at 400 to 450,000. Over the last month, but the distribution of those cases has changed quite a bit. In particular, Eastern Europe, you can see the orange area here, how it really, over the last 2 months, has really grown in terms of its share of new cases. South Asia, as you can see, is way down from where it used to be, and South Asia has also come way down. So even though the total case rates have been the same, the regions that are experiencing those new cases continue to move around. Europe overall represents almost 50% of the daily new cases now. So it's 48%. North America went down a little bit. We're about 20%. And then all the other regions are less than 10%. So really, as you'll see on the next map, new case growth, whether you look at it total or per capita, is really concentrated in Europe and North America. A few other spots. So this map is new, and it looks at the new cases per million population in the last week, and then divides the countries up into quartiles, which are the top quartile of countries that had the most new cases per million in the last week, and then the third quartile and the second quartile and the bottom quartile, and they're color coded as shown. And the way those quartiles break down is that the top quartile of countries right now is experiencing about 1,400 new cases per million population. And then the third quartile is between 380 and 1,400. And the second quartile is between 30 and 380. And then the green, the lowest quartile, is less than 30. So you can see it's a very big range. It's more than 40x from where the top of the lowest quartile is to the bottom of the highest quartile. So, and there are relatively big countries with case rates. I think the top one is about 9,000. We have ranges. We have some countries that actually have zero that are small, but they range from tens to almost 10,000. So it's still a very big range over the last week of new cases. So the red, the place where the per capita case growth is highest, you can see it's very concentrated in Europe here, the UK, Germany, the Netherlands, and Belgium, most of Eastern Europe, with the exception of Poland and Russia, Turkey, and then Armenia and these countries in here, and Mongolia, and then the US. So that's really most of the case growth in those spots. You can see there are a couple red spots down here in French Guiana, but they're pretty isolated and small. And the orange, the next quartile, are some of the larger outbreaks like Canada and Brazil. And surprisingly, Australia is seeing some case growth, and they have a very low population, so they don't need a whole lot of cases to get up above 380. I think those are the notable ones. Iran is down to 380, down in the third quartile, the 380 to 1,400 range. And you can see most of Southeast Asia is in the second or third quartile now. And then green is most of Africa, and the cases being reported there are pretty low, especially in the populous countries. So they're green. Don't know how good a job all those countries do at capturing all the cases. There are some countries in that area, that we don't have data for, at least I didn't find data for. Anyhow, as reported, those are very low rates of per capita new cases. Same with China, Pakistan, as you can see. Japan, after the big surge that was pretty much coincident with the Olympics, is back down very low again. South Korea is actually bumped up a little bit into the second quartile, but still below the median. So I think that's a quick walk around what's happening. But you can see how, particularly the South Asia and Southeast Asia area, for the most part, is in the first and second quartile now. So moving into the country models, these are data from Friday. The R-squareds remain good. Kazakhstan continues to struggle with fatality reporting. So this is the cumulative cases view of things, and you can see where we had been pretty linear, it's actually turning a little bit concave downward in the global total, and we have a little bit here in the UK is still rising, Turkey also. Most of the other outbreaks have leveled off. You can see that here. There's this little cowlick kind of on the end of the case graph. Part of that comes from the weekly reporting, but some of it may be case growth. You can see, again, the UK and Russia still here, rising recently compared to the rest of the world, which mostly peaked in September. These are fatalities. It's also bending down a little bit. This one's the US. You can see Russia still going up. I'll talk a little bit in more detail about Russia and fatalities in a little bit. And daily fatalities, we have the same artifact, same as last month, where there's a little cowlick on the end because of weekly reporting in some jurisdictions. And this is Russia, this green one. For the most part, everybody else has peaked and is coming down in fatalities. So the 5 largest outbreaks are the same as they were last month: the US, India, Brazil, UK, and Russia. Brazil and India have seen declining cases for a long time, so 4 months now since their most recent peak, which is very good progress. You can see they're both way, way lower than they were at their peak. The US has been coming down for about 6 weeks, so not as long, but steady downward momentum to a little bit less than half where we were when we peaked in August. The other two, Russia and the UK, are experiencing case growth. The model is fitting over here Russia as having peaked just now. I'm skeptical. It's not very good at that before it really turns over. So this could go up some more. The UK has just been sort of bouncing around, but increasing as they're doing it, and are just about at the peak that they experienced back in July, and continuing to go up. So those two outbreaks are still increasing. And if you remember from the map, they were both in the top quartile in terms of per capita case growth.
Do you attribute that to them using different vaccines than these other countries, or do you not know what to attribute it to?
Yeah, I don't know what to attribute it to. It's when you look across the countries, there isn't a powerful relationship between how vaccinated you are and your cases. And there is more of one with deaths, and I'll show that. But so, and that could be because of efficacy of vaccines, but I don't know. I haven't tried to. Maybe a thing I could do for next month, look at the different vaccines versus fatality rates versus vaccination rates. It's just sounding more complicated the more I say it out loud, but yeah. So in Europe, Western Europe, some are declining and staying down. You know, France and Spain, Italy are all pretty far down. You saw that on the map. Germany is going up, very rapid case growth right now. It looked last month like they had just peaked, and now they're well past that. Not to an all-time high, but the model is saying they'll surpass their all-time high. Same with the Netherlands, very rapid growth in daily new cases over the last month. And the model is predicting that they'll set a new all-time high for daily new cases. Belgium is started turning up a little bit more recently, and the model isn't predicting an all-time high for them yet, but it's rapid case growth. So mixed behavior in Europe. And when you combine that with the UK, which was on the first biggest outbreaks chart, you have several that are continuing to see daily new case growth, and then a bunch that are low and staying low. In Latin America, it is, for the most part, all still very good. So Argentina is very low, Colombia, Mexico, Brazil, remember, is low, Peru is very low. Chile, which actually has one of the highest vaccination rates with the Sinovac vaccine, to the earlier question, is now starting to surge again and is back up to a couple thousand new cases a day. And if you memorize the map from before, they were orange. So they're in the third quartile in terms of per capita new cases. So, the model's fitting that as peaking pretty soon, but it's a little too early to tell. So Latin America, for the most part, has calmed down a lot from where it was a couple months ago. And in Central and Western Asia, Turkey continues to just be sort of stuck between 20 and 30,000 cases a day. If you remember, they were red on the per capita case map. They've been that way since July. They've kind of been in that band, which is a pretty long time. Iran, after its multiple surges, is down now, to under a quarter of where they were just a few months ago. Similarly with Iraq, and Kazakhstan looks like it's come down quite a bit too. So other than Turkey, these other large outbreaks in the region are continuing to decline a lot from their peaks. Eastern Europe is probably the worst region right now. Not probably, it is the worst region right now. The model is indicating Serbia and Romania may be peaking right now. You can see actually, Romania over the last week had some declines in daily new cases. Same Serbia's kind of a furball of data points up here. It looks like it may be peaking. The others don't seem to be peaking yet. And again, into this group, we would include Russia from the first outbreak chart, individual outbreak chart. So there's a lot of case growth without signs of peaking yet happening in Eastern Europe. And that's why that region of the world was so red on the per capita case growth map. And just Eastern Europe, so, the UN regions are Eastern, Western, Northern, and Southern Europe. So between all four of those, that was the 48% of the daily new cases. Well, 20% of the global new cases come just from Eastern Europe. So it's the most significant kind of regional outbreak we have right now. As I mentioned, South Asia is declining, and you can see you saw India on the earlier graph. Here's Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Nepal. They're all far, far below their most recent peaks, and certainly their all-time highs. So all of South Asia accounted for less than 7% of the global new cases, which is, from July, it was 40% in South Asia, the global new cases. So a big decline. For North Africa and the Middle East, all the large outbreaks have declined significantly. They're all continuing to go down, kind of with the exception of Jordan and Lebanon, which have stabilized at what I'd call moderate levels. You can see that on the map. Also, Jordan is actually drifting up a little bit. Lebanon is kind of flat. But they have stopped coming down over the last few weeks. The other outbreaks all are showing the typical kind of declining to very low level behavior. And similarly, Southeast Asia is continuing to decline. All of the large outbreaks experienced very rapid large surges, and now they're experiencing very rapid large declines. It's unusual behavior. Usually the outbreaks are not quite so sharp and rapid, but that's being seen pretty much all across the region. But Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam are all looking like things are under control and their new cases are falling. Couple other outbreaks of interest. Canada, I like to show sometimes because they're, neighbors. They've peaked, not coincidentally, maybe peaked similar to the time we peaked, and they're come down about half like we have. But they definitely are seeing consistent and sustained declines in daily new cases. Japan is another very sharp outbreak that has fallen back to where it was for a lot of the pandemic, very, very low case levels. As you saw on the map, it was green in the first quartile. Cuba, which is, had a huge surge and had a huge vaccination program and is now pretty vaccinated, is falling to almost 10% of where they were at their peak. The ones on the bottom are a little bit less of a good story. They're all in Europe, Austria, Greece, and Georgia. And they're all seeing, right now, growth in daily new cases. The model is variously fitting it as peaking very soon or not, but we'll have to see next month. So this is a nice map. I actually got this from The Economist. They did an analysis globally of excess deaths. So, the excess deaths, I've talked about them a couple times in these talks, where you look at historically how many people die over time in 2017, 2018, 2019, and there's some seasonality to it. And the hypothesis is that we may not catch all the deaths that should be COVID. An elderly person dies at home from COVID, and it may not be caught. They may not be tested. But usually, countries do a fairly good job of accounting for deaths from all causes. They keep track of how many people died. And so when we see big deviations from the historical average for July or August, we call those excess deaths. And so this is a review for all these countries of the excess deaths compared to 2019 for the period of 2020 and 2021, so for the pandemic period. And this first graph is a view of, or map, is a view of the official COVID-19 death counts as reported by the various agencies in the different countries. And so you can see the scale down here. This is, I guess I should have put it, these are deaths per 10,000, I believe. And the dark red is the highest, and blue is actually negative. So you can see nobody's blue. So nobody in this case, because you can't have negative deaths. We'll actually see some blue in the next one. And the Peru, excuse me, Peru is pretty dark red. This is, I don't know, it's next to Croatia. It's one of these Eastern European countries that's pretty dark red. But when we compare it to excess deaths, now this should, yeah. So now this will just oscillate so we can kind of look at countries. So the first thing to notice are the blue ones. So the blue ones actually, in terms of how many deaths they experienced in 2019, they actually experienced fewer total deaths in the pandemic period than they did in 2019. So that's Australia and New Zealand and Greenland and Iceland and Norway and Benin. It's some of these are notable for not having a whole lot of COVID throughout most of the pandemic, and others are just perplexing, like Benin. So those actually may be, I don't know, there's a lot of things you could hypothesize about that because of the lockdowns, people getting fewer car accidents, other kinds of diseases are not being transmitted because of the public health measures being taken. But those countries actually, from an excess deaths point of view, didn't experience any excess deaths above the historical average in the course of the pandemic. which is interesting. For just about everybody else, we get a darker color when we flip to the excess deaths, which means that the number of reported deaths for COVID is smaller than the number of excess deaths from all causes. And the assumption, the inference is that there is likely some underreporting of COVID deaths based on that being sort of the extraordinary circumstance that separates the pandemic period from the preceding periods that are being used to calculate it. You can see the US gets darker, Mexico gets a lot darker, but Canada actually gets lighter. So Canada's reported COVID deaths actually exceed slightly their excess deaths from all causes, which may be another instance of the rate of deaths from other causes being actually reduced by some of the things people are doing or not doing during the pandemic. But for the most part, other countries are darker. So they're actually seeing more deaths than we're counting for COVID. So I'll assume you had enough time to look at all the countries you want to look at as they blinked on and off. And this is a look at the same data set, but over time and by region. So this is the cumulative deaths per 100,000, and the kind of rose-colored data up here are excess deaths, and the gray is reported COVID deaths. So you can see globally, these are the reported COVID deaths. These are the excess deaths, and you can see there's a significant offset. The daily graph of the same data is here, and you can see similarly there's excess deaths, and if these bumps look reminiscent, that's because they correspond with the COVID surges, right? So it's clear that at least part, or at least most of these excess deaths are due to COVID, because when they occur is coincident with the COVID surges. This particular one, biggest one here is India. And I talked about India last month. These are the ones the same data, but broken down by regions. So you can see North America, not a whole lot of excess deaths. And when we've looked at the US data, at least, it's been fairly consistent. The number of COVID deaths reported is really within the confidence interval for the excess deaths. Mexico, not as much. It's more indication there's underreporting in Mexico. And as I mentioned, Canada actually may be a little bit of the excess deaths are a little bit lower than the COVID deaths. So the bulk of this gap in North America is Mexico. Asia is where the big gaps are between Southeast Asia and South Asia. There appear to have been a lot more deaths than were officially attributed to COVID. The official deaths are 5 million. We just crossed 5 million global deaths from COVID that are officially attributed to COVID. From the excess deaths, the estimate is 17, and the 95% confidence interval is +2 - 7, so between 10 and 19. So there's a 95% confidence that we've at least undercounted by half the actual COVID deaths. And the largest number of that undercounting happened in Asia. And as I mentioned, excess deaths, when you look at Oceania down here, where Australia and New Zealand were blue, excess deaths are actually negative in Oceania. And then wanted to zoom a little bit in on Russia, kind of like I did on India last month. So in terms of excess deaths, Russia has recorded 723,000 more deaths since the start of the pandemic than the same months in 2019. So since over the 18 months or so between March 2020 and now, there have been about 723,000 more deaths than would have been predicted based on the historical rate of people dying in Russia. So, and that's about 500,000 more deaths than the official COVID death toll, which is 230,000 as of now. And it appears that, and this actually, I had mentioned this earlier this year, that you can see it in the fatality patterns in the Russian official data. You can see here but it appears that it's getting closer. And so you can see, for example, here we have our biggest excess deaths in the very end of last year, and that's where we have this peak in deaths. But we have even more daily deaths in July, and yet even more in October. But you can see that those excess deaths are actually smaller than they were in July. So the degree of underreporting, just from looking at the graphs, looks like it may be less now than it was last year. And when we actually pull the data out and put it on a graph, that's this here. These are the first the last 3 quarters of 2020, so the beginning 3 quarters of the pandemic. And then these are the first 3 quarters of 2021, the most recent 3 quarters of the pandemic. And this is the ratio of the excess deaths to the reported deaths from COVID. And you can see the ratio has fallen from a little under 6 to about 2.5 averaged over those periods. So it does look like, however, whatever's happening, there's a much greater agreement. I mean, if you call being off by a factor of 2.5 agreement, but there's much more agreement between the official COVID deaths and the excess deaths. So those may be coming together as either systems improve or whatever's happening. That ratio seems to be coming down a lot. And if you recall, we didn't see quite as dramatic a fall over this same period in India, but the ratio, their ability to officially account for cases and deaths improved over the course of the pandemic, and that ratio fell, but it didn't fall as much as this is falling. Okay, moving into US state models. Again, R squareds are all fine, and these are data from Friday. As always, we have 51 models that I fit for the 50 states plus DC. The sum of the states models predicts 50 million cases for the US and about 1 million deaths, which would be about a 2.2% case fatality risk, which right now is about 1.6. So the deaths may be a little bit overstated. The general trends, the case and death prediction is the same as last month. So it hasn't moved one way or another. With a few exceptions, most of the resurgences seem to have peaked, and some are way down. The individual country model is pretty close. It predicts 45 million cases for the US and 800,000 fatalities. So a little bit higher in fatalities for the sum of the states model. About 0.8%, so 2.5 million more folks in the US population have been confirmed as a case in the last month. So that's only about 2/3 is the rate of the previous month in September. But it's triple the rate, still triple the rate in July. About 3% of the population received a vaccine over the same period, and that's about the same as last month and about the same as the month before, and half the rate of 4 months ago. So these are the individual states, the 10 biggest state outbreaks, and then their sum. You can see this is definitely flattening out. This is California here, flattening out. Everything's pretty much flat, concave downward to flat. And you can see that on the daily graph. So we've come down from 33,000. Sorry, I'm reading the wrong side of the graph. 170,000 new cases a day to something like 70. So not quite to a third yet. And all these large outbreaks are declining to much lower levels than they were in their peaks. Fatalities, not so much leveling out yet on the cumulative graph. They're going up in California. They're going up a little bit in Pennsylvania. So as I'll show on the next few graphs, there's some spots where things are still pretty high rates of new fatalities. And this is the way the daily fatalities look. So, we're down in the 1,500 neighborhood. We've been 1,400 to 1,700 for 5 or 6 weeks without continuing down as we would like to see. So we're a little bit plateauing on deaths, and that's why that cumulative curve isn't really flattening out. So looking at what's happening, picking some of the states that are notable. So this first box on the left, these are the 7 states that contributed the most new cases to the U.S. In the last 2 weeks. So they had the most new cases. California, and where the number of new cases, their share of new cases they contributed exceeds their share of the population by more than 25%, they're red. So it means that compared to all the other places that are having cases, they're having more than their share, significantly more than their share of cases. So California and Texas are big states. They had the biggest contribution in terms of number of cases, but it's significantly below their share of the population. So their per capita rates are actually lower. Michigan and Pennsylvania, you can see their per capita rates are actually a lot higher. They're contributing a lot more than their share, similarly with Ohio and Colorado. And in particular, Colorado is quite a lot of new cases, high per capita case growth. And when you take this and translate it into new cases per 10,000 population over the last 2 weeks, these are the 5 biggest. Alaska is still the biggest, but it's down from about 200 last month. This was about 200. And all 5 of these were above 100. So they are coming down. But Alaska, Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota, and Idaho, all pretty much north and central for the most part, except Alaska's west. But at any rate, that's that part of the country that is consistently having the most cases. And on the map, there are just 5 listed here, but I colored in the top 10 on the map. And it's really this north central part of the U.S., Alaska, and West Virginia. Those are the biggest per capita case growth we've seen. Now, where's the fewest per capita case growth? Well, the fewest out of all the states actually is Florida, which is hugely different than it was a month ago. And Texas, Louisiana, Missouri. Missouri was a very big hotspot 2 months, 3 months ago. And in the mid-Atlantic states. So compared to last month, it was California, Illinois, New York. Now it's, some states scattered around the south central and southeastern U.S. and some mid-Atlantic states that have the lowest per capita case growth. And you can see for these are these 7, the case growth. Michigan, hasn't really started to see a decline in new cases. Neither is Pennsylvania, and certainly Colorado still seems to be surging. The other ones look like they've peaked and come down. This is California here. So when I do the tally of which states are going up, which states have reached new peaks. There are 17 states, one of which is DC, even though it's not a state, it's one of the things I model. There's 17 states that have more cases in the last 7 days than the 7 before that, and that's versus 15 last month. So about the same, really. I mean, 2 states different isn't different. So we're, overall coming down, but still we have in the neighborhood of a third of the jurisdictions are seeing more new cases in the week up to now than the week prior to that. But no new states hit a new high in daily cases in the last 2 weeks versus 2 states a month ago, 2 states the month before that, and I forget how many 3 months ago. It was a lot. So no new highs in daily cases, which is great. It's consistent with what we see in the overall U.S. model or some of the states model that we're overall coming down from our peak, and that seems to be happening pretty broadly with a few exceptions in some of the states. This hasn't really changed much from last month. I may not put this in every month, but this is the distribution of case fatality risks across the world by country and across the U.S. by state. The overall global case fatality risk is 2%, and you can see, clustered around there are all these countries. And then here, kind of at the edges, the outliers, Peru and Mexico on the high side, with high case fatality risk in the 6 to 8% range. And then we have these outliers on the very low side, UAE and Israel, with case fatality risk in the 0.7% and less range. So still a very big range, about 30x among the countries from the lowest to the highest case fatality risk. For the states, we have a similar pattern, but a much less dispersion in the data. So Utah and Alaska have unusually low case fatality risks, 0.7 and 0.8, I think they are. New Jersey has the highest at 2.3 or so, but you can see it's not even outside of the confidence intervals for the distribution estimate. So we don't have states that have the kind of unexpected dispersion to the high side of case fatality risk like we do with countries, which is probably not surprising. And as a result, the range of case fatality risk in the US is a lot narrower. It's about 5x from the lowest to the highest. And just as I said last month, over the course of the pandemic, this range has gone down a lot by an order of magnitude, both in terms of countries and states. So as I mentioned, my California County model got corrupted somehow, so I didn't have time to fix it and run it and make charts, so I decided to not do it. But I do have, of course, the individual state model for California, and it predicts about 5 million cases and about 80,000 deaths. So the death prediction is down a little bit from 100,000 last month. The case prediction is the same. And the model case fatality risk then would be 1.6%. And right now the actual is about 1.5%. So again, you can see cases coming down, cases really peaked right around the 1st of September. And so they've been coming down for 2 months. And over that same period, deaths really haven't been. They've been pretty flat. In fact, the model can readily optimize a fit to this where cases or deaths are continuing to increase. So I'm not sure I understand that or have an explanation for that, why 2 months after cases peaked, fatalities haven't begun to decline, but they haven't in California.
Does it have to do with it being a pandemic of the unvaccinated? That the unvaccinated are more likely to, yeah.
Yeah, I guess if the if the fraction of the unvaccinated in the number of new cases was growing. But at least in Santa Barbara County, it doesn't seem to be, right? So, because we've got fewer cases coming in, and unless that cohort of cases is growing less and less vaccinated, you should still see them track. But no question, the majority of people that are dying are not vaccinated. And in Santa Barbara, we've had a decline in daily new cases, not quite as much as statewide, but we're about half where we were in mid-August. Deaths, similar to the state behavior, are pretty flat. They're about 0.7 per day. They're about 0.8 per day last month. They're not coming down like cases yet. And we also see that in hospitalizations. Hospitalizations aren't coming down. They've really been between 40 and 45 for 5 or 6 weeks now. And they're just flat. They just seem to be not going down yet in hospitalizations. But they're still very much elevated compared to where things were in June, as is testing positivity. So testing positivity peaked at about 9% in August. It's just below 3. It's 2.8%. And it was that level in mid-July, kind of as we began to get into this most recent surge. But it's still 4 times as high as it was in June. So, or 6 times, 4 times as high as it was when we went into June. So there's still active transmission, and it's not quite coming down as fast as it has in other surges. And certainly fatalities aren't. Fatalities really seem to be plateaued, as do hospitalizations. Okay, some updates on the variants. And there isn't really a whole lot of new news on variants. This is the phylogeny chart for the overall clades of variants, which has expanded. And I'll talk about that a little bit. But Delta globally made up 97% of the global sequences as of October 16th, which is a pretty much all, means mostly. It's pretty much all of them. You may notice, if you've been keeping track of your next strain clades, that now Delta is not just 21A, it's 21A, I, and J. And they've split Delta into these 3 different strains of Delta. And I'll show that on a couple places. The CDC hasn't done this yet, but the next strain, GISAID folks have. And so it makes, you got to pay a little bit more attention to some of the graphs. I'll show you that. So we've continued to see more divergence from the original genome of the virus, as expected, more different variants with more number of mutations, but still nothing is showing up that we can see evidence of something we may have the variant, but there's no evidence yet of anything displacing Delta. And where that splitting of the Delta into 3 clades shows up is on this graph, this global fraction. So this is squished so that the timelines line up, because this graph doesn't start till November of 2020. And this one goes all the way back to December of 2019. So this is made to line up. So these blue things you see here match this blue, and all this kind of lime green stuff you see here matches this. So these are synced up in time. But you can see these 3 different green to blue-green bands in this prevalence graph are all Delta. They're the 3 different flavors of Delta. And you can see that it's actually the 21J version of Delta that is becoming the dominant version of Delta. even though 21A is the original one based on their naming convention. But all in all, Delta, the three flavors of Delta make up 97% of the sequences. So those are summed over these three because they're all, from the WHO and CDC perspective, it's just Delta. It's not 21A, I, and J. There's very little that CDC updated on the variants being, this is really mostly a variants being monitored cheat sheet now, because all the variants that aren't Delta were changed from variants of concern to variants being monitored just because they weren't being detected very much. They did add the finding that the disease severity may be increased for Delta, whereas before this used to be just a question mark, but that was officially noted by the CDC. Lambda still has not been classified by the CDC. And other than Delta, this one here, all the rest of them have been demoted to variants being monitored. And still no variant of high consequence, which is very good. And here's the variant progression in some countries. So this is the UK, the US. Most of the countries in the world pretty much look like this. You know, it was some colors, and then it was alpha, and then now it's Delta. These three are the ones that had more interesting newer variants come up and become prevalent. This is, of course, in Brazil, it's Gamma or P1, but it is now almost completely displaced by Delta. In Peru, it was Lambda, and you can see now, as we started to see last month, Delta is displacing Lambda. And in Colombia, it was Mu, and you can see Delta is now even more clearly than it was last month displacing Mu. So it doesn't look like any of those things that have been identified as variants to monitor or of interest right now, we have seen any evidence that they're going to displace Delta. This is a view I hadn't shown before of progression by variant. So these are the sort of six famous variants, celebrity variants. And this graph, each of these lines is a country. And this is the fraction of that country's sequenced samples that are that variant. So for alpha, you can see how alpha really took over, and all these lines up here near 100%, including in the US. It was the predominant variant in the US. Not quite like Delta, though. But now it's come all the way down. And this, in case you don't know all your three-letter country acronyms, this is Cambodia. So for some reason, Cambodia had a bit of a resurgence of alpha, but it looks to be now being displaced. This is beta, which of course started in South Africa, very prevalent in South Africa, and now it's pretty much gone. This is P1 or gamma, and it was very, very dominant in Brazil, and now not so much. This is Delta. You can see it's pretty much near 100% or heading that way in essentially all the places where they're being monitored. This was interesting. This is Argentina. And if you look at P1, it looks like it's maybe making a bit of a comeback in Argentina. But there's a big caveat. It's a very, very small number of sequences in Argentina for these most recent periods. First, they don't have a whole lot of cases. If you recall, they're pretty far down in terms of their new cases. And secondly, the most recent, on all these, always the most recent observation is they just have enough sequence to make or just have enough data to put something on the graph, and more data will come in. So we'll see next month how this looks, but I This is just very uncertain because of the small number of sequences that represent this estimate. This is Lambda, which was the most prominent variant in Peru for quite a while. And it was also in Chile. And you can see it's come down. And Mu, which was the most prominent variant in Colombia, and now it's also come down quite a lot. So Delta, all these charts, can be summed up in Delta is really displaced all the other variants of the virus for all practical purposes. This is the progression in the US. So Delta has represented more than 98% of the sequence cases since the 1st of August. So all the, even by the 2-week periods, each one has been above 98%. And the others have pretty much disappeared. And Mu and Lambda were just getting here shortly after Delta took over, and they never really got started. This is the variant progression in some states. These all look pretty similar, pretty much like the national ones and like many of the country ones, where you have some diversity of the variants in the earlier periods, but then it was Alpha and now it's Delta. California, we were 99.92% Delta with the last set of sequences. And for these states, there were, in the last set of data on the right-hand side of the graph, there were 6,100 roughly sequences done. 5 weren't Delta. So very, very much Delta. This is Santa Barbara County. Most of the variants of interest, the variants being monitored, have been detected here, including Mu and Gamma. Delta was more than 93% in July and August, and it's been 100% so far in September. See, we're up to about 50 cases sequenced in September, down from 200 in July, but again, we're having fewer cases, not a quarter, but we're having fewer cases. This may still go up a little bit. It more than doubled since last month, even though we were at the end of September. And so far, only three sequences are in for October. So the lag time between case date and sequence results is more than a month. Vaccines. So this is some assorted countries, population receiving at least 1 dose. You can see there's some going up really fast, like Vietnam and Iran, some places that have had recent surges, and those two happen to be coming down a lot now. Whether it has to do with the vaccine or not, I can't say for sure, but it isn't hurting. US is still pretty flat. We've been passed by lots of countries, even though we were in an early lead in deploying the vaccine. We're not administering it at the rate most other countries are. And so our vaccination level is lagging a lot of the other countries where a vaccine is available. Russia is also struggling to vaccinate its population. It's under 40% vaccinated. And then South Africa is coming up slowly. And many of the low-income countries in Africa, unfortunately, at least from the reported cases, the incidence of new cases is pretty low there. But the administration of the vaccine is also very, very low in most of Africa. We're still delivering about 25 million doses a day across the world. And so up to now, we've vaccinated about 49% of the people in the world have gotten at least 1 dose. So that's up 7% from September. We're just coming up to half the people in the whole world being vaccinated, which again this just blows my mind that this is getting done. It's about 3.8 billion people have gotten a vaccine. And here's the world. These little jumps place in the world are when China reports vaccinations kind of in batches, not daily. This was also an interesting map. There was a global target of 40% of each country's population being vaccinated by the end of this year. It was established in August by the UN and the WHO and the World Bank, these world organizations, to get all the countries 40% vaccinated. So the green countries are already 40% vaccinated or more. So most of the Europe, essentially all of Europe and North America, most of Latin America, a lot of Southeast Asia. The purple countries are on track to be 40% vaccinated based on the rate at which they're administering vaccines and where they are right now. And so that's pretty much a lot of the rest of the world. And the glaring big chunk of orange, which is not on track to be 40% vaccinated, is Africa. And very little of Africa is on track to be 40% vaccinated, including, countries that, might be surprising, like South Africa or Egypt, that are pretty developed countries. But they're not on track right now. And then there are a few scattered around, Papua New Guinea and the Philippines, a few other countries. So this is this partitioning graph I showed the last couple months of looking at, which countries had the highest per capita deaths over the last week. And what is their vaccination status? Not surprising, given the case rates, the countries with the most elevated per capita death rates. A lot of them are in Eastern Europe: Lithuania, Latvia, Serbia, Russia, Romania. Actually, they're pretty much all in Eastern Europe, and you can see the vaccination rates are fairly low. So certainly below where they were vaccinated. The comparison I make is 30 days ago. What was their vaccination rate? Because that would be the time when somebody got infected that became a death in the last week. They were all under 50% vaccinated, all below the global average, except for Lithuania. And I don't know what's going on in Lithuania. They're about as vaccinated as we are. And they were on this list last month, and they're on it again this month, even though their vaccinations continue to go up. But they have a very high daily fatality rate per capita. And the range, these are all the countries that have daily deaths more than 7 per million per day. And I ended up, this is for countries with more than 1 million population, because there were a couple, like Bermuda had 1 death, and it was, or Bermuda to the Bahamas, someplace in the Caribbean had 1 death, and it put them into this category. So I put a cutoff of 1 million population where we get a reasonable sample size. This is the way the vaccinations are going in the US. So, all this stuff from before is the same. And what's happened in the last month is, flat, maybe slight increase in daily new vaccinations. The state now that has the highest percent vaccinated population is Massachusetts. Used to be Vermont last month. This month is Massachusetts. The lowest, it's a tie between Idaho and West Virginia. Last month, it was just Idaho. And West Virginia has tied Idaho by having far and away, actually it's really displaced from the rest of the states, lowest new vaccination rate per capita by a lot. And that makes this range now about 9 to 1. Last month, it was about 4 to 1. And really, this Maine went up a lot. Maine's having some case growth. And so their vaccination rate went up a lot, but also West Virginia's went down. And that's made the range that spans the states go up. It's about double last month. So in the US, about 67% of us are vaccinated, 58% are fully vaccinated, and 97% of the 65 and older are vaccinated, and about 85% of that population is fully vaccinated. So those are all up, 2 or 3% from last month. That's kind of the track we're on, is 2 or 3% a month. This is the way it looks in Santa Barbara, and this is this graph that I appreciate that they put together, looking at the new case rates for unvaccinated and vaccinated folks in the county. And it remains about a 4-to-1 ratio. So the case rate of unvaccinated people is about 4 times the case rate of vaccinated people. So as we've said a lot of times, you might still get sick if you get vaccinated, but you almost for sure won't go to the hospital or die. And it's only about a quarter as likely that you'll get sick. In Santa Barbara, our daily vaccinations actually are creeping up. They've, August and September were, call it the same. September might have been slightly lower, but really since reaching a minimum in July, they've been inching up, our daily vaccinations. And they're about 1,000 a day in October. And they were down at about 600, between 600 and 650 in July. So about a 50% increase.
Dave, does that include the booster shots that a number of us are now eligible for? Like I went and got my booster. Would that be counted here?
That's a good question. Probably it would. Yeah. So they don't really call that out in the data. So, but it wouldn't be counted in this by person one, right? So getting a booster shot. So 67% of the population is vaccinated, but actually that actually resolves one little data question I had, which is it looked like the number of doses being administered went up from September to October, but between September and October, 2% more of the population got vaccinated, but between August and September, 3% more of the population got vaccinated. And that actually may explain that discrepancy, that some of these doses are boosters and they don't move this number.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense.
Yeah. 60% of the population is fully vaccinated. And, of those that are eligible, we're getting close to 80% being vaccinated, of the people who are eligible to be vaccinated. And, we're pretty much at 80% for people over 50. Actually above 80% for people over 50, and continuing to just creep up.
Does that eligible to be vaccinated include the new guidelines around the 5 to 11-year-olds?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Certainly there aren't. Maybe, I don't think there's anything here. So, conclusion slide. So for the current outbreaks, the model estimates about 270 million cases and about 6 million deaths. And again, if you look at the excess deaths, it would imply that our best estimate really should be about 17 million. But in terms of official deaths attributed to COVID, about 6 million, which gives about the same case fatality risk as we currently have. The case forecast is up a bit from 250 million last month, and the death forecast similarly is up a little bit from 5 million last month. So, which of course we've hit 5 million now. So that's, I think in a lot of places, kind of like I talked more about it in terms of California, but in a lot of places we're not seeing deaths fall as much as we're seeing cases fall. Case fatality risk is about the same. It's been the same for about 6 months. And so we'll see. And again, the model all these numbers are assuming that nothing that's down just starts to turn up again, but that's what they all seem to have done 4 or 5 times over the last 18 months. So, yeah, so if there are any questions, I can address those. Yeah, if there's no questions, then we'll figure out when to do it, maybe the weekend after Thanksgiving. Nah, I don't want to ruin my weekend. Thanksgiving making charts. Look for it in early December, probably. Yeah.
All right, Dave, thanks.
All right, thanks.
Thanks, Dave.